rather a separate entity independent of it. Nagarjuna points out, though, that it is, and for the proponent of this view, it must be possible not to appropriate, otherwise nirvana would be impossible. So, there will be a non-appropriator who once was an appropriator. But if appropriation is the basis of the identity of the one who has been liberated with the one who was not, that appropriation should persist in the non-appropriator, which would be contradictory.
8. So it is neither different from the appropriating nor identical to the appropriating. There is no self without appropriation. But it is not true that it does not exist. Thus we cannot use the existence of appropriation as a basis on which to construct a permanent self. For that self cannot be both permanent and identified with such a constantly changing activity. But still, that is all there is to the self. This raises the possibility that it would be correct to say that the self does not persist at all, that there is no existent person in any sense. It is to this view that Nagarjuna now turns. He first announces the conclusion that it is not correct to say that the person who now exists did not exist in the past. There is a sense in which that person is identical with her past stages. 9. To say, in the past I wasn't, would not be tenable. This person is not different from whoever existed in previous times.
10. If this one were different, then if that one did not exist, I would still exist. If this were so, without death, one would be born. If there were a genuine difference in entity between the current stage and the previous stages of a person, they would be independent. If that were so, the current stage, since if it depends on anything, depends on the previous stage, would come into existence depending on nothing. That is, it would be possible for none of my previous stages to exist, but for me, as the person with my past, to pop into existence ex nihilo. Or, on the other hand, it would be possible, if the current stage and previous stages were completely different and independent, for the current stage to come into existence without the previous stage having passed out of existence, which is absurd.
11. Annihilation and the exhaustion of action would follow. Different agents' actions would be experienced by each other. That and other such things would follow. We could make no sense of the actual empirical fact of conventional personal identity. Action done at one moment would be done by one person, and that person would experience none of its consequences. To the extent that we could make sense of them at all, the phenomena of memory and experiencing the consequences of one's previous actions would become interpersonal affairs, which seems at least a bit odd. 12. Nothing comes to exist from something that did not exist. From this errors would arise. The self would be produced, or, existing, would be without a cause. Moreover, since the past, as per the discussion of time in chapter 19 and the discussion of dependent origination in 7, does not actually exist, we would have the consequence of an existent, the present person, being brought into existence dependent upon something that no longer exists, some past person. Anything that exists has some past.
13. So, the views, I existed, I didn't exist, both or neither, in the past, are untenable. While Nagarjuna has not explicitly considered the both or neither horns of the tetralemma, we have seen enough of these arguments by this stage to know how to complete the picture. Since neither a continually existent nor a discontinuous self makes sense, both can't make sense, since that would just be double nonsense. And that neither option is not open, since there is no third alternative. Nagarjuna now points out that the argument applies straightforwardly to the future existence of the self. 14. To say, in the future I will exist or will not exist. Such a view is like those involving the past. Another possible avenue to a permanent self is the classical Indian view, not unlike certain Judeo-Christian views, that the human soul partakes of the divine, and that its divinity is what engenders its eternality.
15. If a human were a god. On such a view there would be permanence. The god would be unborn. For any permanent thing is unborn. 16. If a human were different from a god.
On such a view there would be impermanence. If the human were different from the God, a continuum would not be tenable. But if the human is at all different from a God, as is eminently plausible, i.e., nobody seriously argues that humans simply are gods, then the permanence of the divine in no way entails the permanence of the person. There is another possibility, however, namely that the person is part divine and part mortal.
17. If one part were divine and one part were human, it would be both permanent and impermanent. That would be irrational. The problem with this option is that either we say that the person is both permanent and impermanent, which is contradictory, or that the divine part is permanent and the mortal part impermanent. But if the person is a mereological sum of these two parts, then since there is an impermanent part, the whole is constantly changing and the inherent identity of the person from moment to moment is still lost. 18. If it could be established that it is both permanent and impermanent, then it could be established that it is neither permanent nor impermanent. That is, the both and neither horns of the tetralemma stand or fall together. Permanence and impermanence are mutually exclusive and exhaustive alternatives. They can neither be co-present nor co-absent. The option of asserting them in different voices, conventional and ultimate, is not open to the opponent here, who is trying to defend an inherently existent self.
19. If anyone had come from any place and were then to go someplace, it would follow that cyclic existence was beginningless. This is not the case. As Nagarjuna has argued, if there were to be true identity through time, so that the person who exists now is literally identical to one who existed in the past and to one who will exist in the future, this would have to be in virtue of sharing some essence. But this would make real change impossible. The person, once in samsara, would be there. Essentially the state of being in samsara would hence be inherently existent. Here Nagarjuna is using the term, beginningless, as a synonym for inherently existent. If samsara were inherently existent, it would have to be eternal and unchanging. Nirvana would be unattainable, and samsara would be utterly hopeless. But given the possibility of transformation, it follows that such literal identity must be abandoned. 20. If nothing is permanent, what will be impermanent, permanent and impermanent, or neither? Finally, given that there are no permanent entities, no entities, from the ultimate point of view, can serve as inherent bases of predication. That is, the views that Nagarjuna has been considering regarding the nature of the self, which purport to give its ultimate nature, must all be seen as incoherent on that ground alone, namely, that they propose an ultimate analysis. Nagarjuna now turns his attention to views not about the self, per se, but about the world as a whole. 21. If the world were limited, how could there be another world? If the world were unlimited, how could there be another world? Nagarjuna begins by questioning the sense of the question regarding the limits of the world. It seems to be like a question about the size of A.